Hello guys, and welcome back to the History and Politics Vault with me, Ryan Gladman. Today for episode 8 of the Cold War Gcse 9-1 Superpower Relations and the Cold War series. Today we're going to be looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, but first of all I hope you are all well and okay during the another day of the COVID-19 situation. Keep going through it. I think that's the best we can do, just keep abiding by the rules. But actually, with regards to this, if you want any further information, John Lewis Gaddis' Cold War book is a very useful guide for analysing perspectives from both the Soviet Union side and the American side in the Cold War. It's got loads of different later revealed documents that weren't available to the public at the time during the Cold War. Maybe uncovering different secrets that maybe you didn't know, and our historians have recently found out. There's lots of images in there to help you to illustrate the idea that Gaddis presents as well. So very useful. I think it's about £10 on Amazon. So if you're interested, make sure you look at that. But today it is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was quite simply the closest that both powers and the whole world came to the nuclear war throughout the Cold War. And because it was such a significant moment, when people remember the Cold War, they normally remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as the main feature of the Cold War, and it did epitomise how easily maybe the two sides, so the Soviet Union side and the American sides, could have gone to nuclear war. But first of all, a bit background to Cuba. The increased tensions over Cuba were due to the economic interest that Cuba was trying to separate themselves from the US, because the US controlled most of Cuba's industries, railways and things like that. So in 1959, a rebel named Fidel Castro led a successful revolution against the unpopular and repressive military dictator at the time of General Batista. He was a great independent, as I said before, from the US, and he took all American property that was allocated in Cuba. So he managed to overthrow Batista, take this property, and the American response to this was that they banned the import of Cuban sugar, which was a main part of their economy, and it threatened to bankrupt the Cuban flow of money and how many lives were actually revolved around the Cuban sugar. So in response to the US's response, Cuba was aware, Castro was aware of the communist growing influence in the East from the Soviet Union. So he decided to lean more towards them and distance himself from the US capitalist approach. And Castro used US influence into Cuba and began to move closer to the Soviet Union by the Soviet Union actually offering to buy Cuban sugar and then to provide machinery and technological help in return. So this trade agreement that was starting to arise really angered the US. And so in 1961, the USA organised an attempt to overthrow Castro, known as the Bay of Pigs incident invasion. And it actually failed because they underestimated the popularity that Castro had. They thought Castro was a rebel who wasn't really well liked in power, but actually he was a very well liked leader who was doing many things for the interest of Cuba itself, and not Cuba in the interest of the US. And as a result of this failure, Castro even grew closer to the Soviet Union, proposing more trade talks with them about different things that they could enter relationships with the Soviet Union with. And the Soviet leader Khrushchev at the time, in May 1962, made an agreement with Castro where the Cuban territories would be able to station Soviet nuclear weapons. And on the 14th of October of 1962, America knew two spy planes, the spy planes that the Americans used to survey intelligence within countries, took photos revealing that this was being built and progressed in Cuba. There was many nuclear bases that were being made in Cuba, and this really set up the crisis that everyone remembers about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because on the 20th of October 1962, Kennedy, so President Kennedy of the US, decided to make impose a naval blockade around Cuba to try and prevent Soviet missiles and equipment reaching Cuba by ships. And actually, the Americans then started to search any ship in those waters because of the threat that it might be a Soviet ship with trade missiles, weapons, nuclear technology trying to go to Cuba. And then the day after, Kennedy made a broadcast to the American people informing them of this potential threat that Soviet Union might have been moving very, very close to the US because geographically Cuba was just below where the US is. And on the 23rd, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy insisting that the Soviet ships would use force, so he would to enter or to go through the blockade because he was made aware of this blockade, and he decided to confront Kennedy by saying they would use force if they had to try and go through this blockade to Cuba. And then the day after, he issued a statement insisting that the Soviet Union would use nuclear weapons. So this threat of force was backed up by the use of nuclear weapons that they would have to initiate in the event of a war. So Khrushchev realised that maybe this was escalating to a state of war, and so he decided to declare that they would use nuclear weapons to oppose the US. The day after that, on 25th, Kennedy wrote to Khrushchev asking him to withdraw missiles because now Kennedy realised the escalating threat of this Cuban missile crisis. So he asked Khrushchev to withdraw missiles from Cuba. And then Khrushchev replied the day after that saying he would withdraw the missiles if the USA promised not to invade Cuba and actually withdraw its missiles that it had in Turkey. Turkey was very close to the Soviet Union, and the US had managed to station missiles there. So the Soviet Union tried to compromise with the US, saying that if you did remove your missiles from Turkey, we will remove our missiles from Cuba. And controversially, the day after this, actually, a US spy plane was shot down over Cuba. And that was the point where either the war would start or compromise would have to take place. So Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, he managed to propose a Soviet Union compromise, and he said that the USA would withdraw missiles from Turkey as long as it was kept secret. So this acknowledgement and this agreement made by the Attorney General helped to de-escalate the threat of war, but it was so close to a threat of war, nuclear war. And on the 28th, Khrushchev accepted this agreement, and so the tensions that arose from the Cuban Missile Crisis were de-escalated. The consequences actually of this were not just that it was the closest both countries came to a nuclear war, but actually it was the start of a period known as détente. Or not quite known as détente, but actually it was the start of a de-escalating tension period in the Cold War. So, for example, the hotline that was created between the Soviet Union and the US to ensure that communication was kept to stop any further escalating tensions. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 meant that both the USA and Soviet Union agreed to stop testing nuclear weapons above ground and underwater. So these agreements started to be made where they acknowledged that they needed to stop the enhancing and increasing arms race that they both had, because it would increase the threat of a nuclear war, which neither side wanted. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, together with Britain and several other countries, meant that both countries, the US and Soviet Union, promised to use outer space for peaceful purposes and not to place nuclear weapons there to threaten the other countries. In 1968, there was a Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Basically, non-proliferation means this spread, no spreading of nuclear weapons. So it was designed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons to Eastern countries, especially because the Soviet Union were planning to do this quite rapidly. And actually, because of this series of these tests and these acts and treaties and things like that, the relations between the two main superpowers, the USA and Soviet Union, really benefited from it, and it became much more less hostile. So, for example, actually, the USA began to sell grain to the Soviet Union, and this compromise and this trade agreement was a good indication of the de-escalating tensions that had arisen from the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fact that they were starting to go, and now both sides tried to reconcile with each other. However, I think in the next episode, when we look at the Czechoslovakia, Prague Spring that happened, these tensions arose again, and it led to a period called détente, which was needed to de-escalate any lingering tensions that both countries had with each other. But the Cuban Missile Crisis itself was the closest that each side came to a nuclear war with each other, and actually, because it was able to de-escalate with the treaties as listed before in the 1960s, tensions arose from the crisis, were able to disappear, and the Cold War went back to a Cold War state. Instead of being a physical nuclear war, possibly, it went back to a Cold War state of just political tension that was lingering around from both sides of the world, really. The eastern sides, normally the communist referred to side, and the capitalist west, led by the US. So yeah, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very significant point in the Cold War. It could have gone either way, and it had gone the worst of the two ways, then we could be existing in a different country today, a different world today. But luckily it didn't, and then we'll look at the other incidents that happened in the Cold War as well. But thank you for watching today. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like, subscribe if you are new, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you again probably later today or tomorrow. Thank you for watching.